On a foggy October morning in 1823, Charleston County woke to a discovery that would cast a shadow for generations. 7 enslaved people had disappeared overnight from the Ravencraft plantation, leaving behind their broken shackles and a single blood-stained document stamped with the seal of Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft. That document, when examined, revealed a chilling web of betrayal, greed, and cruelty that tied into the highest ranks of Southern society. For nearly 2 centuries, the Ravencraft family poured fortunes into keeping the story hidden. But newly uncovered letters have exposed the truth behind what history now calls the Wedding Gift Massacre. Colonel Ravencraft's supposed gift to his bride did not just unravel his own legacy, but altered the balance of power across the region. To understand the roots of this nightmare, we need to step back to Charleston County in 1822, when cotton stretched like an ocean across the land and fueled both wealth and prestige. Among the elite, no one commanded more authority than Colonel Ravencraft, a decorated War of 1812 veteran whose government land grants and ruthless discipline had made him one of the most respected men in the South. Towering in stature with sharp gray eyes and a soldier's bearing, he was known as a man who expected obedience in every setting. Whether from fellow officers, society's elite, or the 200 enslaved individuals laboring on his 3,000 acres. Unlike most planners, he kept meticulous records on every enslaved person. Skills, families, histories, and even monthly estimates of their financial worth. Cold numbers that reflected his calculating nature. His bride-to-be, Cordelia Peaton of Savannah, came from one of Georgia's wealthiest families, bringing not just beauty and education, but also a sizable inheritance. Their union was hailed as the perfect blend of military honor and old Southern money. But Cordelia had ambitions beyond hosting parlors and raising children. During their carefully chaperoned courtship, she revealed a keen interest in plantation management, pressing for details about crop yields, labor organization, and profit margins. Ravencraft, impressed by her sharp mind, shared knowledge he usually reserved for male advisors. Beneath her charm was a woman shaped by immense privilege and a family fortune built not just on cotton, but on the buying and selling of enslaved people across multiple states. This alliance, celebrated publicly as a triumph, would soon expose the darkness at the heart of both families and culminate in one of the most disturbing chapters of Charleston's past. Cordelia Peaton had been raised in a world where people were nothing more than assets, bodies, to be traded, bred, or discarded according to market value. When her marriage to Colonel Thaddeus Ravencraft was announced for October 1822, society buzzed with excitement. It was to be the event of the season, a 3-day celebration with guests arriving from Virginia to Louisiana. No expense was spared, French champagne was shipped and musicians traveled from New Orleans, and a special china set was commissioned in England, embossed with the combined Ravencraft and Peaton family crests. But behind the glittering spectacle, Cordelia harbored a request unlike anything whispered in the halls of Southern high society. One evening in September, during a private dinner in the Colonel's study, she asked for a wedding gift. No Southern bride had ever demanded complete legal ownership of 7 enslaved people from his estate. She presented her request with the calm authority of someone discussing flower arrangements. Thaddeus, unsettled, listened as she explained her vision. She wanted a single-family unit, parents, 3 grown children, and 2 grandchildren. She argued this was not a sentimental choice, but a strategic one. Each individual had been studied and cataloged in a portfolio she produced, detailing their skills, health, and potential. The older generation excelled in blacksmithing and textiles, the middle in medicine and raw strength, while the youngest children, she noted, could be molded through new training methods. What Cordelia did not openly reveal was the darker side of her plan. Through correspondence with contacts in Cuba and Brazil, She had learned of brutal systems too extreme even for most southern planters. Psychological manipulation, forced breeding, and punishments designed to sever family bonds and create total submission. She intended to turn these 7 people into subjects for what she called an experiment in efficiency. For Colonel Ravencraftoft, the request was both shocking and strangely compelling. Southern custom dictated that wives managed household staff, not field laborers, and certainly not as independent owners. Yet Cordelia's plan promised something more, a potential solution to fluctuating cotton prices and rising costs. If her techniques proved effective, they could reshape the entire operation of his plantation. Over long evenings in that study, the two of them refined what they would name the Peyton method, a system designed to maximize productivity by breaking the human spirit as thoroughly as the body. The 7 enslaved individuals would be the first test subjects, and their fate would determine whether the system spread across Ravencraftoft's 3,000 acres. Discretion was essential. To secure the arrangement, Ravencraftoft enlisted Charleston attorney Marcus Bellwether, a man whose reputation rested on absolute secrecy in delicate plantation matters. Legal papers were drawn to transfer ownership to Cordelia immediately upon marriage, with provisions ensuring that no neighbor, no rival, and no official could discover the truth. At Cordelia's insistence, the chosen family would be moved to a secluded corner of the estate. There, under the guise of a textile workshop, she would begin her work away from prying eyes. It was a plan that blended cruelty with calculation, and its consequences would echo long after the wedding festivities faded. As October drew near, Colonel Ravencraftoft convinced himself that his bride's unsettling request was not cruelty, but progress. He had always built his wealth on bold risks and sharp strategy, and now he saw those same traits in Cordelia. To him, their marriage was no longer just a union of families. It was a partnership that could redefine plantation management across the South. What he did not realize was that whispers of their unusual arrangement had already escaped their private circle, and those whispers would soon turn their grand wedding into something infamous. October 15th, 1822, arrived with crisp skies and a golden light that made Charleston County appear like paradise. The Ravencraftoft estate had been transformed into a stage for spectacle oak trees lined with silk ribbons, tables piled with imported delicacies, and carriages carrying more than 200 of the region's most powerful figures. Governors, senators, judges, and plantation magnates gathered in their finest attire to witness what promised to be the most celebrated wedding of the year. Cordelia glowed in French silk, while Ravencraftoft stood tall in his military uniform. But the true drama of the day came not from their vows, but from the ceremony of gifts. Tradition dictated a groom's present, a necklace, a carriage, a fortune in silver. But Ravencraftoft had something else in mind. Calling for silence, he addressed the crowd with the confidence of a man used to command. He announced that his bride had asked for no jewels, no carriages, but something practical and forward-thinking: the complete legal ownership of 7 enslaved individuals. He described their skills, their potential, and the innovative management methods Cordelia planned to apply. His speech praised her intellect and entrepreneurial spirit, framing it as a bold step toward the future of plantation prosperity. To the guests, many of whom lived by the same brutal systems, the announcement was more intriguing than shocking. Several congratulated Ravencraftoft and even sought details on how they might involve their own wives in similar progressive ventures. Yet not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the county physician, was disturbed by the cold, clinical way human beings were reduced to test subjects. Reverend Samuel Hartwell felt a deeper unease, recognizing in Cordelia's words a cruelty that stripped even the pretense of humanity from those enslaved. Cordelia herself, buoyed by attention, spoke freely during the evening. With champagne in hand, she explained her vision of breaking family bonds to create more obedient labor and establishing psychological controls that would reshape plantation life. Her tone was cheerful, casual, as though she were discussing music or flowers, and the chilling nature of her words slipped past many of her intoxicated listeners. The celebration stretched on for 3 full days, a blur of feasts, dancing, and entertainment that would be remembered as one of the grandest gatherings in the region. But beneath the glittering surface, the true wedding gift was already being put into effect. In a remote outbuilding disguised as a textile workshop, the 7 chosen individuals were taken from their families and subjected to the first steps of Cordelia's experimental program. For the wedding guests, the Ravenscraft-Oft union was a triumph of wealth and power. For those 7 souls, it was the beginning of a nightmare. They understood immediately what others would not grasp for months, that Cordelia's methods were not innovation, but something far darker than the cruelty they had already endured. The building chosen for Cordelia's secret program sat nearly 2 miles from the main house, hidden deep within the pines and accessible only by a narrow, winding path. Once a tobacco barn, it had been transformed over the summer into something far more sinister. The walls were reinforced, the windows barred and set so high they offered no glimpse of the outside world. Inside, small isolation rooms lined the hall, each designed to sever family communication, while at the center stood the instruction room, outfitted with restraints and punishment devices, more cruel than anything typically seen on southern plantations. The 7 people sent there were not strangers to the Ravenscraft-Oft estate, but a family that had lived and labored on it for over 3 decades. Joshua and Rebecca Kane, both in their 50s, were respected for their skills. He a blacksmith, she a seamstress. Their children, Samuel at 28, Mary at 26, and David at 24, had grown into reliable workers, trusted with varied tasks across the plantation. Completing the family were Mary's 2 young children, just 6 and 9 years old. Their closeness, their reputation for mutual strength and support, was precisely what made them valuable to Cordelia, who believed destroying such bonds would create more compliant, isolated workers. Her methods began with separation. Each member of the family was confined to a different living space, with meals delivered at staggered times to ensure no chance for conversation. Any attempt at communication was punished not only against the offender, but also inflicted on a randomly chosen family member, sowing fear and resentment. Cordelia deepened the divide with lies, telling Joshua his son Samuel had questioned his abilities, while whispering to Samuel that his father had asked for harsher punishments. These fabrications slowly poisoned the trust that had once been the family's greatest defense against hardship. Her cruelest innovation was something she named productivity bonding. The family was forced to compete against each other in assigned tasks, with rewards for the top performer and punishments for the weakest. But the punishment never fell solely on the one who failed. It spread to those they loved, ensuring that success carried guilt and failure carried unbearable shame. What had once been bonds of love and loyalty became chains of fear and despair. The arrival of winter made conditions even harsher. Short daylight hours meant longer stretches of confinement, and the cold crept through the walls of the converted barn. Cordelia kept detailed notes on each individual, charting their emotional decline and physical exhaustion with the same precision one might use to track household accounts. She knew her subjects must be kept alive, their suffering carefully managed. Rations were calculated to maintain health, but never satisfy hunger, and sleep was sabotaged with thin mattresses, poor blankets, and deliberately uncomfortable arrangements that left each person perpetually weary and vulnerable. Cordelia's program was not designed to kill. It was designed to break. And slowly, under the weight of isolation, lies hunger and fear. The Kane family began to unravel. Through the long winter months of 1822 into 1823, Cordelia made her visits to the hidden building a daily ritual. She arrived with 2 overseers, men chosen not for loyalty to the plantation community, but for their cruelty and isolation from it. Sworn to secrecy, they served as her enforcers, while she observed, questioned, and meticulously recorded the breakdown of the Kane family. Each member was interviewed separately, their words twisted into data for Cordelia's notebooks as she refined her methods of control. What she failed to see was that she was not creating compliant subjects, but instead pushing her captives past the threshold of fear, into a state where nothing remained but anger and the will for vengeance. By February 1823, whispers began to spread through the quarters. The Kane family had been too important, too respected to simply vanish without notice. For more than 3 decades, they had been the backbone of the community. Joshua, the skilled blacksmith; Rebecca, the seamstress who mended clothes for dozens of families; Samuel and David, trusted for their strength. Mary, sought out for her knowledge of herbs and healing. Their absence was glaring, and the enforced silence surrounding their fate only deepened the unease. One woman in particular refused to let the truth stay buried. Martha Washington, the elderly head cook who had served in the Ravencroft household for over 20 years, quietly began piecing together what had happened. Trusted by both enslaved families and even members of the household, she moved carefully, listening to scraps of conversation, watching deliveries, and gathering accounts from those who noticed strange things on the estate. What she learned was chilling. The overseers assigned to the remote building were not ordinary supervisors, but men hand-picked for their willingness to carry out acts of cruelty beyond the accepted norms of plantation discipline. Wagons arrived with disturbing supplies, medical tools that looked more suited to torture than healing, heavy restraints, and crates of provisions intended for long-term confinement rather than temporary punishment. And on certain nights, when the air was still and the plantation slept, faint screams and desperate cries drifted from the direction of the pine woods, followed by stretches of silence so unnatural they unsettled everyone who heard them. To confront this growing dread, Martha began organizing secret prayer circles. At first, these gatherings were framed as moments of worship and comfort, but they quickly became something more. They turned into spaces where enslaved people could exchange fragments of information, share observations, and confirm what they suspected about the Kane family's disappearance. The circles gave the community strength, a place to grieve, and a network for quiet resistance. They became the first sparks of a collective awareness that Cordelia's secret experiments, no matter how hidden, would not remain in the shadows forever. The prayer circles Martha Washington had organized grew into more than moments of solace. They became a quiet engine of unity on a plantation long divided by size, distance, and differing backgrounds. For the first time, men and women who had previously known each other only in passing began to see themselves as part of a larger whole, bound together, not just by shared suffering, but by a shared purpose. Through whispered testimonies and careful observation, they pieced together a clearer picture of Cordelia's hidden program, one that went far beyond the polite descriptions of innovation that society guests had once applauded. From the shadows of the pine woods, those who dared to watch reported scenes that could only be described as systematic torture. It was cruelty not for discipline or profit alone, but to break human will itself, to erase individuality until nothing remained but obedience. Martha understood the risks of discovery, but she also understood the necessity of memory. She demanded that everything learned about the Kane family be preserved through oral testimony. Each detail was memorized by multiple individuals, ensuring that if one person was silenced, the knowledge would live on through others. What began as survival storytelling slowly hardened into something more dangerous, an underground record of atrocity that carried the seeds of resistance. As winter gave way to spring, a shift took hold. The enslaved workers of Ravencroft's estate, who had long been trained to endure and to keep their heads down, began to whisper of alternatives. The disappearance of the Kane family was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was a warning of what could happen to any one of them. That realization pierced through years of fear and resignation, and for the first time, talk of resistance spread from circle to circle, a fragile but growing fire. Meanwhile, beyond the quarters, Cordelia's reputation was rising. Plantation owners from surrounding counties requested audiences with her, eager to hear about her efficiency methods. Rumors of her program stirred curiosity and admiration in circles of wealth and power. To them, the Kane family had become less a family and more a case study, a proof of concept that might reshape the economy of the South. Cordelia knew that failure would expose her to ridicule and diminish her standing, but success could cement her as a pioneer. The coming spring planting season became her stage. She planned to release the Kane family back into the fields, their altered behavior on display for both her husband and the visiting planters who awaited proof of her brilliance. After 5 months of isolation, manipulation, and control, Cordelia expected to reveal perfect obedience, a demonstration that her Peyton method could bend even the strongest family into unthinking instruments of labor. But her calculations missed the deeper transformation taking place inside that hidden barn. The Kane family had not been broken in the way she intended. Stripped of trust, comfort, and safety, they had forged something new, a shared resolve that survival would mean striking at the heart of their tormentor. What Cordelia believed to be submission was in truth the mask of patience. That transformation crystallized in David Kane, the youngest of the adult children. His natural leadership had made him one of Cordelia's prime targets for punishment and isolation. Yet rather than shatter him, her cruelty refined him. His pain hardened into purpose, his despair into strategy. By March of 1823, David no longer thought in terms of endurance. He thought only of revenge and of leading his family in one final desperate act to reclaim the dignity that Cordelia had tried to erase. David Kane had spent the long winter not in despair, but in study. Every detail of the building, every habit of the overseers, every nuance of Cordelia's visits became part of his mental map. He noted which doors were left unsecured at dawn, which tools could be turned into weapons, how the sound of footsteps or voices carried through the wooden walls. What Cordelia mistook for a man breaking under her program was in truth a man sharpening his mind for the moment he knew would come. Even under the harsh rules of isolation, David managed to keep his family united. Through coded taps, faint hums, smuggled scraps, and gestures, exchanged during work periods, the Kane family created a hidden language of survival. What looked to Cordelia like bonds dissolving into mistrust was in fact a conspiracy forming under her nose, a plan built not on fear, but on resolve. The spark came on March 15th, 1823. That morning, Cordelia ordered the permanent separation of 6-year-old Sarah Kane from her mother Mary. The child was to be placed in the main house as a servant, where Mary would see her daily, but be forbidden to speak to her. Cordelia presented this as a final integration test, proof that her conditioning had stripped away the family's natural bonds. But when the overseers came to take Sarah, they walked into the storm that had been building all winter. David stood in their way, not with frantic desperation, but with the steady defiance of someone who had prepared for this very moment. When one overseer raised his whip, he was met not by a single man's resistance, but by the combined force of a family that had chosen death over continued torment. Their rebellion was not chaos. It was strategy. They used tools they had hidden, weak points they had memorized, and techniques they had practiced in silence. The two overseers, hardened men who had spent years controlling individuals through fear, found themselves fatally outmatched. Within minutes, both lay dead, dispatched with the same cold precision Cordelia had once applied to her experiments. But the Kane family was not finished. For months they had endured her daily visits, listening to her voice, memorizing her steps, waiting for the chance to confront the true architect of their suffering. On that warm March morning, they knew exactly where she would be. Cordelia Ravenscraft began her day as she always did, sharing breakfast with her husband in the main house before gathering her notebooks and instruments. With calm confidence, she set out along the narrow forest path, her mind fixed on the day's test. She carried no fear. After all, she believed her subjects had been broken. What she did not know was that they were no longer subjects at all, but an army of 7 united by pain, bound by vengeance, and waiting for her arrival. The morning of March 15, 1823, broke bright and fragrant with the smell of wildflowers drifting through the air and the rhythmic clatter of tools echoing across the fields. From the vantage of the main house, life on the Ravenscraft plantation seemed peaceful, orderly, productive, exactly the illusion Cordelia needed to believe that her methods were working. She walked the narrow forest path toward the outbuilding with the assured gait of a woman convinced of her own genius, carrying notebooks and instruments that would, in her mind, soon reshape the future of the South. But when she entered the instruction room, her world collapsed. The overseers she had trusted lay dead on the floor, their bodies dispatched with brutal precision using tools that had been repurposed into weapons. Around them, the signs of preparation were unmistakable. Supplies had been hidden away. Weapons crafted from ordinary implements were stacked within reach. Escape routes had been mapped. What Cordelia saw was not chaos. It was order, a mirror of her own obsession for control, but turned against her. At the center of the room stood David Kane, his eyes no longer clouded by the submission she had imagined, but sharpened into something far more dangerous. His family stood with him in formation, united not as victims, but as co-conspirators in a design as deliberate as her own. Mistress Cordelia, David said, his tone stripped of deference, "We have been waiting for you. There is something we need to discuss." What followed was not pleading nor rage. It was the Kane family presenting in chilling clarity the case they had built against her. Every detail of Cordelia's program had been memorized, every cruelty cataloged and preserved, not for pity, but for judgment. They understood that their suffering had not been about them alone, that Cordelia intended her methods to spread to become a template for plantations across the South. And so they had resolved that her system must die with her. David Kane, once marked as broken, had become something far more dangerous, a strategist. He understood the machinery of the plantation world, the reactions of its authorities, and the ways in which their story could be preserved, even if they themselves did not survive. Their plan was not simply revenge. It was justice carried out with the same meticulous calculation Cordelia had once used to enslave them. When Cordelia's body was discovered later that day, the manner of her death told a story authorities dared not speak aloud. They would spend decades trying to bury the truth of what had happened in that outbuilding. But whispers carried it forward that on a spring morning in 1823, a family once targeted for destruction had risen together, turned cruelty into strategy, and written their own chapter of retribution in blood. The Kane family's escape was not a simple act of revenge. It was a carefully designed operation meant to expose the truth. In the weeks before their uprising, they had prepared evidence, gathered Cordelia's own notes, and organized written accounts that would ensure their story survived attempts at suppression. They understood that local authorities, bound by ties to powerful families, would likely bury the scandal to protect the plantation system. So they left behind something impossible to ignore. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on March 15th, 1823, Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft rode out to the remote building when his wife failed to return from her daily inspection. What he found would forever shatter the life he thought he knew. Cordelia's body lay in the instruction room, not amidst chaos, but surrounded by damning order. Every tool, every restraint, every instrument of psychological torment had been carefully arranged, turning the building into what could only be described as a museum of cruelty. The Kane family had not only killed their overseers and their tormentor, they had staged the space as a testimony. Cordelia's meticulous notebooks were neatly organized and labeled, making it impossible to dismiss her actions as improvisation. Alongside them was a chilling account prepared by the Kanes themselves, detailing not just the horrors inflicted on their family, but Cordelia's plans to expand her methods across the South. Included were references to her correspondence with neighboring planters who had expressed interest in adopting her techniques. This was no outburst of rebellion. It was evidence carefully curated to prove intention, scope, and systematic cruelty. And then, just as deliberately, the Kanes disappeared. They destroyed nothing beyond what was necessary, stole nothing of value, and left behind an archive that made denial nearly impossible. Their absence was itself a message they had chosen, survival and exposure over vengeance alone. For Ravencroft, the implications were staggering. His wife's program had not been an isolated curiosity, but the seed of a regional movement, one that, if exposed, could topple not only his own legacy, but the credibility of the planter class itself. Within hours, he dispatched riders to summon allies from among the state's most powerful families. By evening, Charleston's elite had gathered at his estate, confronted with evidence that threatened them all. They quickly agreed that ordinary cover-up tactics would not suffice. Cordelia's program was too well documented, her cruelty too systematic, and the involvement of other planters too clearly noted. The solution was what they termed comprehensive suppression. They would erase the truth at every level through bribes, threats, falsified reports, and destruction of evidence. The building would be burned to its foundation. Witnesses would be silenced or intimidated. Newspapers would print only the official version that Cordelia Ravencroft had been killed in a spontaneous slave uprising, quickly crushed by local authorities. The two overseers were described as martyrs to duty, stripped of their true role in Cordelia's scheme. The Kane family, meanwhile, was said to have been captured and executed, though no bodies were ever produced, and no public record of such executions was ever made. For decades, the story of the wedding gift massacre lived only in whispers, the official narrative accepted by polite society, while the truth lay buried under layers of lies, intimidation, and fear. But the Kane family's carefully left evidence ensured that their suffering and their defiance could never be fully erased. They had denied their tormentors the comfort of silence, leaving behind a legacy of testimony that, once uncovered, would expose not only Cordelia, but the system she represented. The dismantling of the remote building was swift and absolute. Its timbers were pulled down, burned and scattered until no trace of Cordelia's workshop of cruelty remained. Yet the true danger was not in the walls or the iron restraints, it lay in the words the Kane family had left behind. Their written account, prepared with care over many weeks, had been crafted to survive beyond the reach of a cover-up. When the conspirators realized multiple copies existed, they knew they faced a threat that crossed county lines, perhaps even state borders. Destroying every version would require a network of silence wider than their own influence could guarantee. Ironically, the very attempt to smother the truth gave it new life. The absence of records, the sudden destruction of buildings, and the hasty explanations created a story too strange to vanish. What might have remained a footnote of cruelty became legend. In slave quarters, it was whispered as proof that even the most powerful could be defied. In abolitionist circles, it became a symbol of the hidden horrors festering behind Southern respectability. The Ravencroft name, once gilded with military honor and social prestige, began its slow collapse into ruin. The first cracks appeared only weeks later. In April 1823, abolitionist newspapers in the North received a series of unsigned letters. Written in educated, precise language, they described Cordelia's program in damning detail: the layout of the building, the names of overseers, the specific instruments used for psychological and physical torment. Most explosively, they quoted directly from Cordelia's correspondence with other plantation owners, letters that tied her program to a wider interest among the southern elite. Whoever wrote these documents had not only knowledge of the plantation's inner workings, but also the rhetorical skill to make northern readers believe. At the very moment when abolitionist momentum was gaining force, the Ravenscroft scandal arrived like a gift. Lecturers read the accounts aloud in meeting halls. Pamphlets reprinted the grisly descriptions. Suddenly, Cordelia's experiments became more than rumor, they were evidence. Evidence that slavery was not simply harsh labor, but a system capable of calculated, systematic cruelty that mirrored the logic of science twisted toward domination. The true devastation for Thaddeus Ravenscroft, however, came not from abolitionist attacks, but from his own peers. Planters who had corresponded with Cordelia or expressed interest in her methods scrambled to save themselves. They cut ties with the colonel, whispering that her madness had been his negligence, her cruelty, an aberration of his household. Merchants who had extended him credit for decades abruptly demanded payment. Banks closed their doors. Once friendly neighbors began avoiding his land, warning their own enslaved workers not to set foot near his plantation for fear that dangerous ideas of resistance might spread. By summer of 1823, Ravenscroft was a man stripped of allies. His military service, once a source of honor, now made him politically toxic. Officials feared that even shaking his hand could tarnish their reputations. Invitations stopped coming. Business partnerships dissolved overnight. On the ground, control of his enslaved population grew more precarious by the day. The Kane family's defiance had become a story repeated in secret, proof that resistance could succeed. Guarding against rebellion required expensive patrols and harsher measures, draining resources that the plantation no longer had. Amid this crumbling empire, Martha Washington, the elderly cook who had once quietly organized prayer circles, rose into something far greater than a household figure. To the enslaved population, she became a voice of resilience, a reminder that unity could protect, and that memory of the Kane family's stand was more powerful than any lash. While Thaddeus Ravenscroft fought to salvage the reputation of his name, Martha ensured that the story he most wanted buried would instead be carried forward, one whispered prayer at a time. Martha Washington's quiet effort to preserve the truth of the Kane family's suffering had grown into something far larger than even she had imagined. By late 1823, her prayer circles had evolved into a covert intelligence network stretching across Charleston County, linking enslaved communities, trusted domestic workers, and even allies in the free black neighborhoods of the city. Through this web of communication, knowledge, once hoarded by overseers and masters, was being passed along where security was weakest, which overseers drank too much, which barns held vulnerable stores of equipment, and when guards rotated their patrols. What began as memory became strategy, and what began as whispered survival became resistance. The effects were soon undeniable. That autumn, a wave of coordinated action struck multiple plantations. Overseers vanished in the night, tools and wagons were burned, cotton stores mysteriously rotted before shipment, and livestock was poisoned or released into the swamps. None of it looked like random sabotage. It was too systematic, too precise, too effective. To the planter class, the conclusion was horrifying. Someone with deep knowledge of plantation operations was orchestrating an underground campaign to destabilize the very system they relied upon. For Thaddeus Ravenscroft, the situation became untenable. His once proud estate was transformed into a fortress. Extra overseers were hired patrols, doubled new fortified outbuildings, erected all at staggering cost. Yet the more he tightened his grip, the clearer it became. that the spirit of resistance was only growing bolder. By December 1823, the proud cotton empire had collapsed into chaos. Crops failed, livestock was gone, and sabotage scarred the fields and buildings despite constant surveillance. The plantation no longer resembled a thriving estate, but a garrison under siege drained of profit and purpose. The end came not in fire or battle, but in arithmetic. Ravenscroft could not sustain the expense of his own defenses. Every measure meant to secure his plantation only deepened his ruin. By the new year, his debts outweighed his resources, his reputation lay in tatters, and even the men who once toasted his honor at grand dinners avoided speaking his name. On January 3, 1824, he made the only move left to him. Standing in the decaying parlor of his mansion, before creditors eager to carve up what remained of his estate, Thaddeus Ravenscroft confessed the truth. He revealed the full scope of his wife's experiments, the cover-up that followed her death, and his own complicity in silencing evidence. This was not contrition, it was calculation. By exposing the network of plantation owners who had encouraged or supported Cordelia's methods, he hoped to drag them down with him and salvage some fragment of dignity from his own ruin. Instead, his confession became a weapon in the hands of abolitionists. Circulated in northern newspapers and abolitionist meetings, it was cited as undeniable proof that slavery was not merely labor, but an institution of systematic cruelty engineered with scientific precision to break human beings. Ravenscroft's downfall was complete. What had begun as a carefully concealed wedding gift ended less than 2 years later as a confession that shattered the illusion of planter honor, leaving behind a legacy of shame that even his allies could not suppress. What Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscroft revealed in his final confession was nothing short of explosive. He admitted that Cordelia's wedding gift experiment had never been intended as an isolated project. It was in fact the pilot for a coordinated system of torture-based management techniques meant to spread across the Deep South. Dozens of plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama had been poised to adopt her methods once they were proven effective, turning cruelty into an institutionalized science of control. The goal was chillingly simple: break the enslaved spirit so thoroughly that rebellion itself would become psychologically impossible. His testimony named names, provided dates, and exposed prominent families who had bankrolled Cordelia's work. He described meetings where planters traded advice and resources, all in preparation for rolling out similar programs across their estates. Perhaps most damning, Ravenscroft admitted that local officials, sheriffs, judges, even state politicians had been aware of the plan. In return for promises that successful methods would be shared, they had pledged to shield participants from any legal consequences. The cover-up after Cordelia's death had not been a desperate scramble by a single family, but a coordinated conspiracy involving perjury, bribery, and threats orchestrated from the very top of South Carolina society. Yet within this confession was something Ravenscroft likely never intended to make public evidence of just how far the Kane family's defiance had reached. Documents he had uncovered during his investigation revealed that the 7 family members had not simply vanished into the wilderness, they had made contact with abolitionist networks. Through these connections, they began funneling intelligence about plantation vulnerabilities, overseer weaknesses, and opportunities for sabotage. Their suffering had been transformed into a blueprint for resistance. At the center of it all was David Kane. Far from broken, he emerged as something unheard of in the antebellum South, an enslaved man who had become a strategic threat to the very institution of slavery. His grasp of plantation systems, his ability to forge alliances across racial and social divides, and his skill in organizing coordinated action elevated him from victim to architect of defiance. Under his influence, What began as whispers in Charleston County grew into a regional intelligence network that crossed state lines and fed into abolitionist strongholds in northern cities. Plantations far removed from the Ravenscraft estate suddenly suffered mysterious setbacks. Tools sabotaged crops, blighted livestock, lost workers emboldened to resist. To the planter class, these were not random misfortunes, but signs of deliberate coordination. Ravenscraft's own words confirmed their worst fears. Resistance was no longer scattered or reactionary. It was becoming organized, strategic, and informed by the very knowledge plantation owners once believed was theirs alone. For Southern authorities, this revelation was terrifying. A single rebellion could be crushed, its participants executed as examples. But the Kane family's legacy represented something new. An invisible network that could strike not just at individual plantations, but at the economic foundation of slavery itself. The lesson of the Ravenscraft incident was clear, and chilling cruelty meant to extinguish hope had instead forged leaders capable of turning oppression into resistance. And in David Kane, they saw the emergence of a figure who embodied their greatest nightmare, an enslaved man who had become a general in a war they had never imagined possible. The most shocking element of Colonel Ravenscraft's confession was not the exposure of a conspiracy among Southern elites, nor even the proof of the Kane family's organized resistance. It was the revelation of Cordelia's true fate. According to documents the colonel had first hidden and later surrendered, Cordelia had not died quickly in the March 15th confrontation. The Kane family had captured her alive and, in an act of chilling symmetry, subjected her to the very techniques she had invented. Every form of psychological and physical torment she had designed for others was turned back upon her with careful precision. For hours she endured the full weight of her own cruelty administered by those who knew exactly how to make her suffer. Her death was not a frenzy of rage, but a deliberate demonstration, a final lesson in the consequences of believing that human lives could be reduced to experiments. This revelation reframed the entire tragedy, reminding future generations that the darkest horrors in American history were not products of supernatural evil, but of human calculation of what happens when people convince themselves that some lives are expendable. It left an unsettling question lingering in Charleston County and beyond. Had everything truly been revealed, or were more secrets buried in archives hidden by families desperate to erase their complicity? By February 1824, the once grand Ravenscraft plantation was abandoned, its fields untended, its buildings left to rot, while creditors fought over scraps. Thaddeus himself vanished after his confession. Some said he fled to Mexico. Others whispered he took his own life to escape disgrace. Whatever the truth, his name became synonymous with scandal, a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by its own cruelty. But the impact of the incident stretched far beyond the fall of one family. In the North, abolitionists seized upon the confession as proof of slavery's inherent brutality. Cordelia's notes and the Kane family's ordeal became required reading in anti-slavery circles, providing tangible evidence that slavery was not only inhumane, but systematically engineered to destroy dignity and spirit. For many who had remained neutral, the Ravenscraft case was the final proof that the institution could not be reconciled with Christian faith or American ideals. In the South, the Kane family's defiance resonated even louder. Their survival and escape shattered the myth that resistance was futile. 7 people had not only endured months of torture, but had turned their torment into strategy, establishing networks that enabled others to fight back, or sabotage plantation operations. David Kane's intelligence network continued to operate well into the following decades, spreading information that destabilized the very system meant to contain him. By the 1850s, planters across the South were dealing with mysterious failures and acts of sabotage that suggested not random defiance, but coordinated opposition rooted in the lessons of Charleston County. The larger truth became impossible to ignore. Cruelty meant to crush resistance had instead created it. In trying to break the human spirit, Cordelia Ravenscraft had unwittingly forged a generation of thinkers and leaders among the enslaved who understood their oppressors' systems better than the oppressors themselves. Long after the ruins of the Ravenscraft estate became a place of whispered legend, locals spoke of strange lights flickering in the collapsed house, of ghostly cries rising from the spot where the experimental building once stood, of shadowy figures wandering the fields as though still searching for something. Visitors came drawn by the eerie history, while storytellers carried the tale forward, a tale of cruelty, resistance, and the haunting reminder that in trying to erase others, Cordelia Ravenscraft and her world had instead erased themselves. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Ravenscraft tragedy lies in what it revealed about the true nature of horror. It was not the work of specters or curses, but the cold calculations of people who believed that cruelty could be justified in the name of progress. Cordelia's program was not a moment of madness nor the heat of passion. It was a deliberate design created by educated, respected members of society who rationalized torture as innovation and human suffering as economic efficiency. The fragments of evidence that survived, scattered letters, coded testimonies, and smuggled notes, became known as the Ravenscraft Papers. Preserved in archives from Charleston to Boston, they remain among the most valuable records for historians seeking to understand not only how the plantation system operated, but how enslaved people developed networks of resistance within it. These documents show both sides of the equation, the cold arithmetic of bondage and the extraordinary ingenuity of those who fought against it from within. Today, almost nothing remains of the Ravenscraft estate. Only a few foundation stones lie buried beneath weeds, and a sanitized historical marker notes its role in agricultural development, omitting the darker truths. Yet for those who know where to look, the land itself still whispers. The outlines of the instruction building are faint, but present a reminder of where 7 human beings endured months of torment before turning their suffering into defiance. Their resistance became not just an act of survival, but the foundation of a network that helped erode the very system meant to destroy them. The story of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft and his wife's wedding gift serves as a stark lesson. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that some of America's darkest chapters were written not by monsters, but by ordinary people convinced of their own righteousness. It shows how systems of power can twist cruelty into policy, and how easily innovation becomes a mask for dehumanization. And it reminds us that the shadows of the past are never truly gone. They linger, urging us to recognize the human cost of injustice before it repeats itself.